set up. I have two layers here, a bone layer and a vector layer. The vector layer is a simple rectangle with a couple points in the middle of the rectangle. And the bones are set up that when I move the bones, it bends the rectangle. Now this is all standard Anime Studio stuff. It's been working this way for years. But what you may be familiar with if you're an existing user is if you bend the bones far enough, things don't start to look so good. See how the rectangle is really being squeezed here in the middle. The way you can correct this is during an animation you can bend the bones to where you want them and then move the points in here to reshape the rectangle so that it looks good. The problem is if you're animating a lot and you keep moving this thing around, you have to keep correcting those points in the middle of the rectangle. So that's where this new feature comes into play. It lets you tell the program how those points should respond to bone movement. So, how to use this feature? The first thing is you need to name the bones that need to be corrected. And one thing that I've also added here in Anime Studio 9 is that every bone automatically gets named no matter what. So this bone here, you can see it with the Select Bone tool, this is B2. This bone over here is B1. You can change the name, so you can name it whatever you want. But let's just stick with the default name here. So this is bone B2, and this is the one that when it bends, gives that distorted shape to the rectangle. So let's correct that. What you do is you bring up the Actions window. There it is. And you create a new action with the same name as this bone. So this is bone B2. So I'll create a new action and I'll call it B2 and click OK. Now I'm now editing this action, and what I'll do is I'll rotate the bone. If you have a bone limit, if you have limit set up, drag it all the way to the limit. Otherwise just drag it to about as far as you expect to really move that bone. And we see the distortion here. So now you switch to the vector layer and use any of the editing tools to move the points around so that it looks good. Now there is a limitation here. This joint correction feature can deal with point movement and it can deal with curvature changes. So I'm allowed to move the points and I'm allowed to change their curvature if I want to. So let's tweak this around a little bit. You know, this is the inside of the bend, so it should have kind of a sharp corner. The outside can remain smooth. You know, maybe I'll bend out or tighten up the outside a little bit. But this looks pretty good. I can switch back to the main timeline now, and what's going to happen is when I move the bones, they now automatically pick up that action and apply it as the bone moves. So you can see that it has a much better look here than it did before. So that's bending it in this direction, counterclockwise. If I bend it in the other direction, clockwise, you'll see that I still have this distortion going on. So what I need to do is I need to create a correction for that direction as well. So let's go back, and to create a correction for the other direction, I create another action with the name of the bone, space, and the number 2. It doesn't matter which one is clockwise and which one is counterclockwise. The program will figure out which one to apply. But one is one direction, the other is the other. So now I'll bend this down this way. Let's move this up here so we can see better. And then I'll go to the point layer, vector layer, and I will move some things around, adjust the curvature. Until it looks good to me. Something like that. I can switch back to the main timeline, the bone layer, and I can move it down, bend it downwards now. You see you get a much more pleasing bend to the overall figure. So this is great. It corrects the funny distortion you were having around the joint. And so I'm just using this manipulate bone tool on frame 0 to test it out. But if I were to go in and start adding keyframes and actually animating this, again, it applied the action here as I bent the bone, and it'll automatically remove the action as I straighten the bone out. Or, yeah, the action. Bend it this way, looks good. Straighten it out. Everything looks great. So this is a huge improvement, I think, to rigging bones and vector layers. So let's add a little bit more. Let's go back to the vector layer, and let's say we have a point right about here. Okay, so I'm adding a point to the rectangle right here. In the animation I had so far, you don't really notice that point because it's just in line along the rectangle. But what I can do is, in this correction action, I can not only correct the area around the joint, but I can really move any point anywhere that I might care to. So let's go in and move this point here. So if this were an arm, let's say, the muscle is now bulging up. Let's go back to the main timeline. And now we'll see that the keyframes where the bone bends automatically includes that muscle bulging part of the action. And when the arm bends down, that muscle bulge was not part of the downward, the B2-2 action. It's only part of the upward action. So that whenever the bone bends upwards, the muscle bulges as well. So you can see that happening here interactively with the manipulate bone tool. I'm going to open up a new file here to show you. This is going to be a little bit closer to sort of a real world example. So here's something that's a little bit more like a character that you might be working with, much more complex, multiple bones, more complex geometry. And this one is without any of this correction applied. So you can see as I bend this leg upwards, there's a funny distortion happening here in the side of the body. And if I bend the lower leg all the way in, you get these holes and loops and things. And you know, people have worked with this for years now in Anime Studio, and you can correct this kind of stuff. But this new feature will make it much easier. So a similar thing going on with this leg. So when I bend it far enough, there's some funny distortion happening here. And if I bend the leg up, 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 you get a kink here in the body. If you, bend it down far enough, you get a kink in this side. That one's a little more subtle, but there's some funny stuff going on. So I've set up a few keyframes as you animate this whole partial character. You see some funny stuff happening here. There's some distortion, more here and there. Okay, so this feature can correct this. Here's a second copy of the same character, same rigging, same animation, but I've set up corrective actions for various bones. B5 as a correction, that's the selected bone right here. B2, which is this bone, has two corrective actions. Let's look at them. One for when it moves upwards, and one for when it moves downwards. And so let's look at the result. When you look at the two characters side by side, when we had this distortion in the original character, here's the original. In the corrected character, it looks much better. Move around this way, and here the leg in the original character started developing a hole and a loop, and the corrected character is just sort of a crease where the leg bends. The body as well, when this leg moves up, you get that ugly kink in the body. This one, there's a corrective action that prevents that kink from forming. In the previous video, I showed you how bone actions can be used to correct the deformation of a character around joints in bones, and that's why it was originally created, was that sometimes when you bend an arm or a leg, there was some distortion around the knee or the elbow, and bone actions were created as a way to correct that distortion. But it turns out they can be used for a lot more. So here I've created a setup. I have some eyes, and I've set up these bones that I'm going to use as control levers. So let me just show you first what it does, and then I'll explain how it works. So I've put tags on the bones. These are not necessary. These are just to show us what's going on. But these tags show what each of the bones is used for. So this one controls the blink of the eyes. This one, the dilation of the pupils. This one is side-to-side movement of the eyes. And this one is up and down movement. So these bones are, in this case, not really being used as bones, but as control levers. We've had users do such a thing before using layer scripting and combinations of techniques, but this is a way to do it with just a built-in feature of the program starting in version 9. And it's kind of cool. I'd like to see what everybody comes up with. This is just a little quickie example. But now I'll show you how this actually works. So each of these bones, first of all, the bones were created with this bone strength set to 0 so that they don't actually distort the eyes. And then each of them was named something. And the name isn't really important, but in this case, it's useful to name it in a way that links it to what it does. So this bone is used to control the blink, and so I named it blink. Dilation, sideways, and up, down. And then what you do is you go to your actions window and you create actions matching each of those bone names. So let's take a look at one. The blink action, if I double click it, in this blink action, it's just a single frame action. The blink bone has been rotated to the other extreme, and then in the lids layer, the eyelids have been pulled down, closed. And so that's it for the blink action. And then when we go back to the main timeline and you move that blink bone, it invokes that action. Hence the name bone action. Similarly for sideways, dilation, and up down. Let's go back to the main timeline. So we end up with an action corresponding to the name of each of these 4 bones. And then during animation, we can just go ahead and move these bones around. Let's blink, look in the middle and up a little bit. And then later on, we'll look back down to the side, dilate the pupils, open the eyelids again, and then all this will be recorded. So you can see the levers moving during the course of the animation and the eyes following the actions corresponding to the different levers. So this adds the flexibility of using bones as control levers to modify an animation. There's a restriction, as I talked about in the other video. In these actions that are tied to bones, you can modify point positions in vector layers, and you can modify the curvature of a curve. In the future, hopefully we'll be able to add everything so that you could animate any animatable property. Right now, though, we're restricted to point position and curvature.